finally wrap up Plato today, and then next time we'll move forward. Um, there's not really any moving forward from Plato, though. That not significantly, as North Whitehead said. Laurel, do you know about Alfred North Whitehead?
Oh yeah, both the math side and the education side.
Yeah. So I know I'm repeating myself, but he's the one that said all of Western philosophy is best understood as a footnote to Plato. So um yeah. I had a math. Oh, I just sent you guys an email, which well, two things happened. One, Gerald sent out an email with a link to a bunch of lectures on if I didn't it just came, so I haven't seen any of it, but it was a series of lectures on, I think, um, neuroscience related to language or something like that. Is that correct?
Well, just the whole structure of your brain and how you put all these pieces together of space, of language, of hearing, of sight, and she just builds this picture of uh, how your brain works with its organization, and its organization is around how we deal with all these complex ideas. And I think in a way, it kind of goes back to where Plato is trying to say, well, we must to understand this so quickly, we must have seen this in a previous life, and maybe in a way, we packed all of that into our brain over about 100 million years of
Well,
putting the tools together to do that assembly.
it couldn't really be otherwise unless we believed in magic, that some kind of supernatural being placed it in our brains. But we're going to talk about that more today. So that's something that Gerald sent out, which I'm definitely going to look at. And then the other thing is I just sent a link to a video which is about, I think it was Laurel, but maybe somebody else brought up the example of the feral child that was discovered in the late 18th century who had been raised without language and without parents. It's a video with Stephen Fry. He's a British kind of TV presenter guy and entertaining guy. And also in the video is Steven Pinker. And I don't know if you know him. Steven Pinker is a philosopher from Harvard who I'm not real familiar with, but I'm somewhat familiar with. And I kind of like the fact that Pinker, one of his things one of the themes of his philosophy is, things aren't as bad as you say they are. You should check out what the Elizabethan murder rate was, that kind of thing. He's pretty funny about that. And but anyway, he talks about the fact that I think we discussed that birds have a window. Songbirds have a window where they during which they can learn the songs of their species, and beyond that they can't learn them. And this same thing seems to be also substantiated with regard to humans, that humans up to about puberty are very fast at learning language, but beyond that, a different process is necessary to learn language. And I suspect, Laurel, that if you had an fMRI, I'm sure somebody's doing this. If you had an fMRI of a child learning language and you compared it to an fMRI of a 20-year-old learning language, I suspect different parts of the brain would be engaged. What do I know about neurology? But I suspect that's the case because it seems to be a different process.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah, I think there's a lot of work done. And I think, for example, there's a certain amount of work trying to do brain studies in children with developmental issues or things. It's tricky because it's hard to get kids to lie still in an MRI machine. So they have tricks and they have ways of doing things, and there are other studies going on too. I'm an external advisor to a group that is doing a comparative study of children with autism and typically developing children, and trying to figure out brain markers that would potentially be able to be tracked. It's sort of like the kid version of the Alzheimer's disease neuroimaging study. They're trying to figure out things that might mark successful intervention things. And it's very political right now.
Oh,
So
cheese isn't everything. That's just it's anyway. Let's not get
yeah,
sidetracked.
but not to get sidetracked, but yeah, brains are really cool, and I think a lot of
Really cool. I'm going
what
to
Plato
quote
talks
Laurel on
about
that.
is a
Brains are really
neuroscience
cool.
basis.
According to Professor Laurel Beckett of Cal Davis, brains are really cool. All right. I'm going to let me tell you a little story about when I was. We're going to talk end up Plato today. Try to, and when I was in grad school, I can't remember why I was going to see this guy, but I made an appointment with one of the very distinguished professors of philosophy, who I don't remember, and I don't remember why I made the appointment. I must have been writing a paper on something that he was an expert in, and one of the benefits of those universities is you can make an appointment with the world expert on something. I mean, it's just really astonishing. Anyway, yeah, he saw me, and I went to his office, and he was very nice, and it was so Victorian. We had the wood lined walls, and he had a 3-piece suit and a bow tie on. And he was probably about 80 and very sharp though, and he had tea served for us. It was just it was just out of another century. Anyway, he what the thing he said to me that I've never forgotten, even though I've forgotten everything else about him. He said that when he was a young man, he didn't understand Descartes. And then at a certain time when he was middle-aged, it all became clear to him. And now he doesn't understand him anymore. And he wasn't saying that he'd lost his mind or that he'd become demented. He was saying that he didn't see the argument, and then he saw it, and then he saw through it, or something like that. I think that's what he was saying. He certainly wasn't saying that his mind had gone. That's not the point. And so I bring this up because I had the same experience with Plato, and I'm very sympathetic to people who are not really grokking it. It's not really resonating with you, because it took me 10 years before I started to see what was going on here and how important it was. It all just seems so blatantly wrong, and also that some of the dialogues seem so simple-minded, but this is an illusion. And well, I don't know. Whether it seemed to me at a later time, it seemed to me to be an inactive, inactor, geez, I can't talk, inaccurate understanding of Plato. So I think Plato and Marx. So if I picked all the philosophers who are the most misunderstood, I think Marx and Plato would be at the top of the list, because all of the common understandings of, and when I say common, I don't mean so much the scholars in this field. I just mean the average on the street kind of opinion of these guys is really very inaccurate. And Marx and Plato are at the top of that list. And Plato really has a kind of cartoon picture. You have a cartoon picture of him. And I was certainly in that camp, that just had a cartoon picture of him. And this isn't helped at all by Plato's way of presenting himself, which is all these dialogues that sometimes appear to be pointless. But I want to read one passage. There's several passages where Plato actually addresses this in the dialogues and also in his letters. I think I told you about it. I think it's the second letter that says, "I'll never write an exposition of what my thoughts are. They're all just Socrates beautified and rejuvenated. But this is from one of the dialogues called the Phaedrus, and he says, um, he's speaking about words, and he says the written word, and he says, you think they were alive, but if you question them, they preserve a solemn silence. Once a thing is put in writing, it rolls about anywhere and everywhere among those who may or may not understand it. Writing is like painting. The offspring of painting stand there as if they are alive, but if you ask them anything, they remain most solemnly silent. And Plato, to his credit, Plato didn't vary from this. I mean, he spent his whole career not writing specifically what he wanted to say. I wonder if he was tempted to. But anyway, what I'm saying is that if you're not following what this, or it isn't resonating with you, I don't blame you, because Plato didn't want to. It's not like he wanted to make it easy for you. I think what he wanted to do was make it a process for you, an engaging process, rather than just something you just accept or reject. That, I think that's what he was trying to achieve with his writing. So, having said that, I'm just saying that under the heading of, if you feel like this isn't making any sense to you and it's dumb, I hear you. Okay, so starting with the two biggest doctrines that seem the dumbest for Plato are the theory of forms and the theory of recollection. The theory of forms, one of the bad things about it is that all the literature, and Plato himself contributes to this, all the literature mentions the world of forms, as if the world of forms was some place that was different, like heaven or something, that somehow we had the ability to see with some part of our brain. And I get what he's trying to do, but I'm not sure that's the best thing. And I'm just going to offer another alternative to that. Rather than saying the world of forms, I'll say the modality of thinking that reveals the forms. I think because I think at this point it's hard for me to not be in with Plato on this, and I'll give you a couple of examples. But it certainly, upon first glance, it seems like, what are you talking about, this ethereal world? I mean, no less a person than Aristotle rejected this, so don't feel bad if you think it's stupid, because Aristotle, this is amazing to me that Aristotle studied with Plato for 20 years and he still didn't accept what Plato's main theory was. He didn't accept it. He thought anything that exists is physical. And it was impossible for him to accept that there was a world of perfection. And bless his heart, but I think Aristotle never got it. And I'm going to give you two or three examples of things that I think are evidence for the kind of thing that Plato is talking about. And the one thing I will admit is I'm not sure that we can say they all come from the same place. In other words, for Plato, there was a world of forms, and it included a perfect rationality, perfect beauty, perfect justice, perfect wisdom, all kind of came from the same place, that world of forms. I'm not so sure they emanate from the same place, but I will say that the longer I live with this guy, the more I feel like there are certain aspects of human perception or understanding that are very difficult to account for. And that's what he's saying. And one of them is the Meno, the slave boy and the Meno. Because what the slave boy comes up with is an answer, a geometric answer. You all recall that the demonstration now, I assume. the geometric answer he comes up with can't be verified empirically. In other words, he didn't come to this by looking at a bunch of examples, and he's not going to go out in the world and look for a bunch of squares and see if he can duplicate them with the process that Socrates demonstrates or that he comes up with. That makes it a peculiar kind of knowledge, I would say. It's self-verifying, as Thomas Jefferson said, self-evident. It's self-evident that all men are created equal, and which isn't self-evident at all. It's not self-evident that they're all created equal. So he must be referring to something that isn't visually perceived. When Jefferson says that, he's referring to kind of a sense of equality that isn't an equality that is perceived by the senses. We'll get back to this with Kant. But so,
Tony,
yes.
is there a difference between a form and a concept?
Well, the Platonic tradition uses, I think he uses the word, there's two words, ideos. So an idea and a form, and I would, the answer would be no. I'm not sure there's any clear definition that Plato ever gives of the forms. He gives you kind of examples of things that may be intuited only through perceptions of the forms, but the forms themselves, I'm not sure. I don't think he ever gives a textbook definition of it. I'd kind of be surprised if he did. I can't think of any time when he did. Okay, so there seems to be one kind of knowledge, mainly mathematics, that is peculiar in the sense that it can't be verified by empirically. But on the other hand, it does explain things that are empirically visible or empirically sensible. Like, for instance, the trajectory of a bullet. We can write a parabola for the path that a bullet takes, and we can film it, and bullet would be a hard one, but it could be done, I suppose. But basketball, the parabola of the arc of a basketball's travel, that's a parabola, and it could be written down in a formula described by Descartes or figured out by Descartes, and it will represent reality. But that doesn't prove that the parabola and the formula are the same thing. That's a different kind of thinking. And so mathematics seems to be self-verifying, and we call that in philosophy analytic. In other words, if you understand the terms that are being used, then the solution will be clearly valid, whether or not you can go out and look at it. And of course, Einstein and other people, Descartes, have made done exactly that kind of thing, created a mathematical thing that later is verified by empirical demonstration or observation, but at the time is just verified within the mathematical world itself, or that framework itself. So anyway, that's number one kind of knowledge that I think is unusual that Plato recognized. And for some reason, Aristotle's going to say that this is all stuff that we gather from observation. This is the empiricist way of thinking about it. And it didn't end with Aristotle. The British empiricists thought the same thing, that somehow what we do is observe the world, and from the world we make abstractions about things like squares and circles. He thinks that we categorize them together and somehow abstract mathematical things. I believe it's fair, but not, it's my view, and not universally shared, that this view is no longer sustainable. But like I said, if you really want to look at this, you can look at just go look at the Wikipedia chapter on the philosophy of mathematics, and you'll see the different schools of thought about what math is. So anyway, clearly mathematics or geometry is central to Plato. And I think that's kind of knowledge that he correctly intuited or understood was not something we perceive with the senses. The truths of mathematics are not just derivable from what we perceive. All right, the second kind of knowledge I would include, and he included in the forms, but I'm not sure they come from the same place, is our recognition of beauty. When you see something as beautiful or you hear a beautiful piece of music, it strikes you immediately as beautiful, even if it's a kind of music you've never heard before. I have my own story about this, and I'm sure you have one. You must all have one yourselves. I was driving along the freeway in San Diego, and Shotgun by Junior Walker came on the radio, and I was so blown away, I had to pull over by the tone and the execution and what he was saying and the lyricism of his playing, not the song or anything. It's, you could say that's just, the Chitlin circuit kind of stuff, which it is. But his playing was so beautiful, I was just mesmerized by it. And what I remember thinking was, first of all, this seems so right, so logical, and so perfect. And at the same time, I've never heard anything like it before. So how is it possible that I know that it's so good if I've never seen anything like it before? And I think this happens with lots of things. I think you've all experienced this. You've all listened to a piece of music or read a poem or experienced some kind of art that just struck you as being so right and so real. And yet you weren't trained to think that particular thing was perfect. If you're like, I've studied, done a bunch of woodworking, so has Doug, and I didn't know exactly what a good dovetail joint looked like before I was trained. I learned what dovetail joints, how you did them and how you put them together. And now I can recognize one, but I don't think I would have intuited that out of nowhere. If I saw one, I wouldn't know whether it was right or not. Somebody would have had to tell me, well, that one's not any good and this one is good. I have to learn it. But somehow with music and with other forms of art, you can perceive something and instantly know that it's beautiful without ever having heard anything like it before. I think that's very strange. And I know I'm not going to convince everybody that that's strange, because it's the things that Plato's talking about are so central to our consciousness and so constantly experienced. And so that they seem just, of course, that's the way things are. Of course, that's natural. Of course, it's beautiful. Well, it's not clear to me why it's beautiful. It's not clear to me that another animal with a different brain would think that's beautiful. Why is it beautiful to us? I can't explain it. And not only that, beauty is something, and I've argued this, Doug D wouldn't agree with this, but it's very hard to account for beauty, our appreciation of aesthetics. And this really is not quite Plato, because he didn't know about the theory of evolution. But if you think about the theory of evolution, it's a hardcore number sorting thing. Things either work or they don't. And if they don't work, they get eliminated. That's all. Or if they work a little bit better, and it doesn't have to be much better. I think the percentage is something like 1% better. In other words, if 1% of this new development in genetics gives you, I mean, if it gives you a 1% advantage, it doesn't take very many generations before that is in the genome. That small of an advantage. And so it's just a hardcore numbers game. And I can't for the life of me see why our appreciation for music or our understanding of math would have been sifted out from all of our other abilities just by the numbers of evolution. I don't see any evolutionary pressure towards understanding music. I'm not saying, I mean, all I'm saying is it's a mystery. And Plato, okay, so Plato goes to the extent of saying, well, it must be because we're born with this somehow from a previous life. I don't buy that. I'm not Shirley MacLaine. I don't think we've been all reincarnated, but it is a mystery that that cries out for an explanation. Yeah, Jeff.
I'm not sure that you're right in saying that it can't have been produced evolutionarily. I suggest that we're just not quite bright enough to figure out what the evolutionary advantage is.
Well, there must have been, I mean, and like I say, unless you believe in some kind of supernatural intervention, it has to have been the result of evolution. But I can't see how it was. That's all. And maybe we will eventually figure it out how. If I had to make a guess, I would say it's because of a there's a word for this that I can't think of right now, but it's uh, kind of an artifact of some other kind of mental thing that was an advantage. In other words, um, you have an ability that turns out to be very good for aesthetics that really was had something to do with flavors or something like that. Well, I just had an ear operation. This is maybe the same kind of thing, and I was amazed that the doctor apparently someplace along my rock and roll career, my right ear got just damaged. And I told a doctor about it, and they said, "Oh, well, there's an operation for that." And I said, "What?" And yeah, they go in and take this little tiny bone out and that's broken, and they put in a fake bone, a prosthetic bone, little tiny. This is all microscopic stuff. And sure enough, I can hear better. But as a result, my taste is all screwed up. My sense of taste is all screwed up. And another thing like this is I don't know if you're familiar with the foxes, the famous fox experiment in Russia, where they bred foxes to be friendly or aggressive. And it turns out when you breed foxes to become friendly, their appearance changes. Their actual physical appearance changes. I can't remember what it is, but I think their tails and their ears change in appearance as they get friendlier. That's a really peculiar thing too. So there are probably genetic mutations that somehow have an effect on a group of things within your evolutionary development. And those group of things may include things that aren't directly related to the thing that is an advantage. In other words, it's an advantage to the fox to be friends with um, human beings. It's a survival advantage. It may not be a survival advantage for them to have different kinds of ears, but nevertheless, it's something that was associated with that particular physiological the physiological development was somehow associated with the mental development. And I suspect music falls into that category, as does math. But this is absolute speculation on my part.
So would you flip that over and say we have the capacity to recognize and appreciate beauty? Is it also the same for the creation? So when Junior Walker created that piece, is that is that parallel?
Well, I actually was going to get to that point next.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
No,
I'm
no,
sorry.
no, no. It's a good segue, because when if any kind of and this Meredith's not here today, but Meredith was talking about how she constructs a brief and how she works on it until she knows it's right. And all artists do this. I was talking about this with Philby the other day, and an artist creating art is the one part of your life that when you do it, the only thing that's at play is your will to create something beautiful. There's no outside influence. You have a paintbrush and you have a canvas, or you have a guitar and you have fingers, and nothing except your will and your heart or your inspiration is between you and creating beauty. And so, and yet you, as I think I mentioned with Segovia, you can practice till you're blue in the face, and as he says, it won't make you a musician. The real artist or the real musician somehow knows that. Well, Leonardo is famous for redoing his paintings many times until he got what was he looking for. So to respond to you, Neil, I think it's slightly different. I don't know, but it seems to me slightly different because the artist doesn't know, like Meredith didn't know going into it what she was trying to create, and yet an artist or Meredith, you're drawn towards, you know, what isn't right. You keep knowing what isn't right, that you can make that line of poetry better, or you can make that melody better. How do you know that? What basis are you, since you're creating something from whole cloth, what are you going on? If you were doing a dovetail joint like I just mentioned, you would have had a mentor, and he would have shown you, okay, this is what you want to avoid, this is what you want to do right, and you would have uh, been trying to match what you knew and were trained to think was good. But that's not true when you're painting something, or when you're writing a song, or when you're playing the saxophone.
There are always outside influences in anything you do.
Well, that's true, but like Stevie Ray
Always.
Vaughan has mastered every single lick that Albert King has played, every single one, and he'll never sound like Albert King. So it doesn't matter. You're a human being, and I don't care how many influences you have. It's all influence. Nobody makes up music out of whole cloth. You're always influenced by somebody else, but you will never sound like them.
No, but there's always an intent in art. There's always an intent, and that intent is what is influenced.
Well, where does the intent come from, though? That's the question.
Your audience, your client, your intent, your political intention, your philosophical intention. I don't know, anything, but it's not. There's not an absence of thought or an absence of intention in art.
No, certainly not. You know, here's another example. Ray Charles, when he started out, sounded like Nat King Cole. That was his role model. And then he developed this other style of singing that was more gospely. When I heard it, the first time I heard it, I went, man, that is magic. Well, how did he get the inspiration to switch from sounding like Nat King Cole to sounding like himself? What was he looking for? This is I'm not saying I have the answer to this, Doug. I'm saying that there is a mystery about human creation. And there is also a mystery about human understanding that goes beyond just rote copying of something you've seen before.
I think the mystery is what causes someone to think that they should change
Right. Exactly.
something.
Yeah, exactly. What do you think it is?
Well, it could be pure commercial greed. I don't know. It could be the audience, could be something internal about something they read. Anything, could be anything.
You know, I've known lots and lots of musicians in my life, and despite the stereotype, I don't think I can think of one musician that didn't do all of the necessary things to become a musician. In other words, all the practice and all that, without just having a love and a devotion and just a desire to sound great. You know, drugs, money, girls, those are all completely peripheral to what the real desire is. And so what is the real desire, Doug? That's what you're asking. I don't think it's pure. If it were purely commercial, then you wouldn't do anything new. You'd do like what Hollywood is doing now, just keep making movies over and over again because you know they sell. But that's not what musicians do. Jimi Hendrix did a bunch of stuff nobody done.
So yeah, Tony, I think that's true. I mean, when I was in high school, I sneaked out of PE class for most of a year to be in an art class, and I might have told that there was a kid in the art class who was like, 20 standard deviations better than everyone in the class. And I assumed there's like a whole pile of these kids in one in every high school. But many years later, and the teacher treated us somewhat differently. She knew he was special. He was focused on art. That was his thing. He was driven to do art. And the kind of feedback she gave him was at a different level than she encouraged me, and gave me good feedback. But what she gave him was at a different level. And then, I don't know, 20 years later, 30 years later, something, I'm driving along and I'm hearing in Boston, and I hear an interview with the top movie poster artist in Hollywood, Drew Struzan. And I'm like, what? So he did all the posters for Indiana Jones and Star Wars, and all the iconic posters for Star Wars. Those are his. Harry Potter. But he has retired from that because at the same time, on the side, he has his own art that he wants to pursue, which he's always done kind of as a sideline and has sold it. But he made, I guess, piles of money. I went once to buy a print of one of his Star Wars things. I think it was for a grandson. And I'm like, what? We're into like thousands of dollars for a little print. So nope, he's not getting one of those. Anyway, for him, I knew him when he was a young teenager. And whatever force was making him have to draw and paint as a 13, 14, 15-year-old, whatever, it would have been 14 or 15, I guess, when I knew him, is still there. He's like almost our age. He was a year or two behind me in school. And he still paints. And yeah, he did the commercial stuff, and it's distinctively Drew. You can tell his posters for movies, apart from some that were contracted out to other people. But there was something about what he did and the way he presented, even sort of a standardized image from some Harry Potter thing, that stands out. And but even though that was quote commercial, his
Now,
art was.
I want to just back up just a little bit, and with a caveat, and that is that Plato wants to eliminate art from his Republic. So I don't want us to get confused here. I raised this issue, but I don't want us to think that it's a central point that Plato makes. Plato's just saying that there seems to be a realm, which he thinks is all contiguous, of appreciation for beauty. Justice is another thing. We've discussed about the fact that you don't just rote by rote follow what your parents say or what your teachers say or what the law says. You do what you think is right. How do you get that? How do you know as an artist what the right thing is? How do you know as a mathematician what the right solution is? Because Laurel can confirm this, but I think that right now AI can figure out math, but it doesn't really know that it's figured something out. It doesn't know that what we would say is, oh, that's right. It knows it because it's seen this solution 1,000 times. That's why it knows it by repetition rather than by intuition or something like that. So I'm just saying that the Platonic idea is that there's a realm of things that human beings know, that the tradition has called the world of ideas. It's also called a priori knowledge before, like I knew Junior Walker was great without being trained to see that kind of playing is great, and that applies to all the things we're talking about. So I want to move on, but just to say, I think that's the core of the idea of the world of forms, not just and Alan, there is a passage in the Republic where Plato talks about the ideal bed, and the thing is that at that particular passage, he's talking about the difference between art and the forms, and the forms are perfect. Like if you were to draw a bed, what Plato wants to say is the drawing of the bed is less real than the bed, and the bed is less real than the ideal bed. So he's making this three-tiered idea of ontology, or reality, as we call it. Catherine, you wanted to say something, or somebody else too?
you said Plato wanted to eliminate art from the Republic?
From the Republic, yeah. That's because art is too much. It affects our thinking too much in an emotional way and not in a rational
Too
way.
subjective.
Yeah, it's too subjective, and that's unfortunate. But I don't think Plato would be insensitive to the conversation we're having right now. I don't think he'd go, "Oh well," because he includes beauty in the forms. And beauty
Right.
is obviously an aesthetic thing, not like a logical thing. So he does include it. So the other thing I wanted to talk about is the theory of recollection, which seems absurd. But we've always already kind of covered this. The point is that I don't believe that we're all reincarnated myself. Plato gets this from the Pythagoreans who did believe in reincarnation. Plato just, of course, he presents it as a myth. I mean, he does everything he can to convince you that these are not written in stone, his theories. He couldn't have, I don't know what else he could have done to try to persuade the reader that these views are not written in stone. He does it by dialogues and by saying all the important things in myth. But anyway, he has the myth of which is the myth of reincarnation. I don't believe that's the case. Nevertheless, that leaves open the question of how do you explain it? And to this day, the things I've just mentioned are not susceptible to some kind of scientific, logical, empirical understanding. We understand a lot of things about them, but the ultimate thing, like how do you know when something just is right? We still don't know that. We don't have any way of saying that, except in the case of like I mentioned with Doug, with the dovetail joint. If you've been trained, yeah, that kind of thing, you know where it's come from. But there are things that we know that we haven't been trained, and that's what Plato's interested in. And just to continue on the review, because that's what I want to do today, some other Platonic doctrines that are important are the three parts of the soul and the three parts of society. You can make of that what you will. I think they're a nice structure for Plato to discuss things. I personally don't think there's a real good reason to divide society with a certain, like Marx has the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. Well, is everybody fall into one of those two categories? I'm not really sure. What about artists? There's another kind of sketchy categorization. So I'm not real fond of the idea of having distinct classes of the soul or of the distinct parts of the soul or parts of society. I think serious Freudians will admit that one of the difficulties that they've never been able to overcome is the exact definition of id, superego, and ego. It's really hard to clarify those terms, and because the human psyche is just not so easily separated or bifurcated or diagrammed, as it were. So I don't know the three parts of the soul. It's worth knowing that Plato thought that. It's worth knowing that he had the political stuff, the guardians, which was a group of people, not one person, but a group of people who had been trained in logic and math and were also streetwise, supposedly, and also couldn't benefit from their decisions personally, leading, and those people would make decisions purely on the basis of the benefits to society without regard to their personal benefit. And then you have the soldiers who are carrying out by doing honor, through honor and a sense of rightness. They're doing what they're doing. And then you have the people taking care of business. I mean, it's not uninteresting. I'm not clear that it could be justified empirically. I'm not sure if, as a science project, I'm not sure you could justify that. Okay, so some criticism. Now, one of the criticisms of Plato, one of the major ones we've already gotten to, which is that this world of forms, that's just airy fairy stuff. It doesn't exist. That's one of the criticisms, and that was the first one by Aristotle. Nor does is the soul eternal. This is also something Aristotle didn't believe. So we can't have reincarnation. So those are right off the bat are two significant criticisms of Plato. Another one is that he believes the world is ultimately rational. And I've said before that every physicist believes this. Otherwise, he wouldn't show up to work every day. If he thought it was just irrational, who cares? If you can't make it all coherent and consistent with other theories that have been demonstrated, if you just can't do it, then give it up. But all physicists are trying to make sense of the universe. They're trying to say, well, that can't be right because it doesn't go with this thing that we know is right. And so that's been the problem with quantum mechanics for 100 years, and the quantum mechanics and the theory of relativity. So the fact is, you have to, at this point, you have to say that the idea that the world is rational and makes sense is a matter of faith and not a matter that has been demonstrated. Many things have been demonstrated that it makes sense. Newtonian physics are pretty well demonstrated, but when we get to quantum mechanics and relativity, okay, so if the world can't be made rational, then his whole theory of the fact that our soul resonates, as I've said before, I like to use the word, he uses the word participates. The physical world we see participates in the world of the form. Another way of looking at it is it resonates, it's kind of vibrating on the same plane, or not the same plane, but the same frequency or something. That whole idea, if we admit that the world is not rational, then it's hard to say that our mind is understanding the actual world. And this is what we come up against, and why people are so why they find quantum mechanics so abhorrent, because it just, and by the way, it's also why the Christian church prosecuted Galileo, because it just didn't make sense to them. They couldn't believe there was a universe that God created that didn't make sense. And then with Kepler, same thing. Okay, so the world is not the center of the universe, but even if you look at the heliocentric solar system model, the planets don't orbit the sun in a circle. What's up with that? It's not perfect. And so Kepler had to figure out a way, which he did with his laws of planetary motion, figure out a way that these all made mathematical sense. Those orbits actually made mathematical sense, despite the fact they looked like they didn't. And all this was coming from the Platonic idea that ultimately God would not have created a universe that was irrational. And it's something we kind of still believe, whether you believe in God or not. If you're a physicist, you believe that somehow the world must be rational. So what I'm saying is, the criticism of Plato is that if fundamentally the universe is not rational, then Plato's whole system is founded on sand, which I wouldn't, or you have to limit it. Like what Kant's going to do is say, yeah, we can't know that. He's going to, what he says is he's going to limit reason to make room for faith. So when we get to Kant, we'll discuss that. Anyway, there are other things. Plato is a massive a bit of stuff, even though it seems easily dismissed at first glance. And this is as good as we're going to do with it. And I appreciate your patience and listening to me try my best to make it make sense. So there we go. Any help I can get from somebody on this? Or criticism or anything?
I think it's been an awesome job. If Plato was teaching for over 20 years, to sort of compress it into rather less than 20 seminar times, and at least make us think, which I guess was Plato's goal anyway. So you're
Right.
making us all think.
Right.
Yeah, I've loved it, even though I haven't been here for every bit of it. Plato has always been it for me. So thank you very much.
Plato has a lot of heart and soul as compared to most of the philosophers, I think. And it's not fluffy heart and soul. I mean, Khalil Gibran is also very, Wordsworth is very heartfelt. But but Plato is hard-nosed at the same time. He's not just going to put something on. He's very, let's just say, he's very careful about putting anything out there that sniffs of romanticism or just hallucination.
Yeah, one of the things I found, Tony, is I always thought of Plato as just sort of like these silly, trivial ideas. And in what you're showing us is it's in many ways his way of thinking and putting things together and examining them. It's almost a mathematics of words that makes him a very interesting thinker.
Yeah, like I say, he's so easy to dismiss. I mean, Wittgenstein, I think I mentioned Wittgenstein dismissed Plato. He read a couple of dialogues and goes, this doesn't go anyplace. What am I supposed to be interested in this guy for? Wittgenstein wasn't, by the way, a professor of philosophy like a lot of guys. Kant was a professor, for instance. A lot of these guys, Bertrand Russell, that was their profession, but Wittgenstein really wasn't. He kind of came from an engineering background, and he was still brilliant. In fact, maybe it was good that he came from the outside, but he apparently didn't know that he was just following the same procedure that Plato was, and addressing exactly the same problems that he was. He apparently was unconscious of that. Somebody must have pointed it out to him, but he says someplace, yeah, Plato, big deal, Well, Ludwig, you're talking about the same stuff in the same way. So what's the deal? But like I say, I think Plato is the most easily misrepresented, him and Marx, of all the philosophers, or the most, maybe not easily, commonly misrepresented, underappreciated for what they have to say. That's not to say they're right or wrong. I'm just saying that they're misrepresented too facilely, too easily. Okay, well, if nothing else, we will proceed with Mr. Aristotle next time. There's several very influential things that he did. And then after that, we'll make some mention of the Hellenistic guys, not much, the Cynics, the Stoics, and the Epicureans. And then we'll be moving into Christianity for Augustine and Aquinas. So that's the plan moving forward. All worth having